I would just like to say that it's both somewhere between a privilege and an honor for me today to introduce our speaker, Bryce Hoffman. Bryce is a best-selling author and top-rated leadership speaker and an unconsultant who believes that individuals have the power to transform companies and cultures through great leadership and applied critical thinking. Bryce is the author of American Icon, Alan Mulally, and the Fight to Save Ford Motor Company, which I previewed in my introduction today. The New York Times calls that a compelling narrative that reads more like a mystery than a business book. And speaking of business books, it has been rated by Bloomberg as one of the 100 best business books. He also wrote Red Teaming, How Your Business Can Conquer the Competition by Challenging Everything, which Jon Gordon called further proof that Bryce Hoffman is one of the great business writers and thinkers of our time. Bryce has also been named by Inc. magazine as one of the top 100 leadership speakers, and he has spent much of the last decade sharing inspiring stories and leadership speakers with audiences around the world, from San Francisco to Shanghai, New York to New Orleans, and London to Las Vegas. In 2015, Bryce founded Red Team Thinking, which is now a subsidiary of True Thinking Corporation, which he co-founded in 2020 with Marcus Dimbleby. Its work is to teach individuals and organizations how to use applied critical thinking to make better decisions in today's complex world. In 2021, Bryce launched the Thinking Leader podcast, featuring conversations with business and thought leaders, cognitive scientists, military officers, and other best-selling authors to share his desire to help people think more deeply and lead more effectively. I will put in the chat his Thinking Leader podcast featuring Alan Mulally. It is number 25. I mentioned Alan Mulally has a recipe for turning around great companies. First ingredient is love. I know that sounds unusual, to say the least, but when you watch or listen to Alan Mulally speak, you will understand exactly why he accomplished turning around two iconic companies in a short matter of few years. In addition to his work with Red Team Thinking, Bryce serves as an advisor to Nobody Studios, a crowd-infused, tech-focused venture studio, which probably the Pitch Freak knows about. If not, Nobody Studios should be on your list. And he is investorincoaching.com. Bryce previously worked for more than 20 years as a newspaper journalist, covering the rise of the high-tech industry in Silicon Valley and the fall of the automobile industry in Detroit. He has received numerous awards from the Society of Professional Journalists, the Society of American Business Editors and Writers, the Associated Press, the California Newspaper Publishers Association, and was a three-time finalist for the Gerald Loeb Award, which is the most prestigious honor in business journalism. He is a resident of the San Francisco Bay Area, living in the Sea Ranch. Could we please all give Bryce Hoffman a very warm GGBC welcome?
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you, Tim, for your very kind introduction. It's a real pleasure to be with you all today. I am at the Sea Ranch, but until the pandemic started, I was living in San Francisco. I kind of bugged out during the pandemic, but it is still, when I say the words "the city," it is the only city I am referring to. And I'm going to share my screen here, if that's all right with you all. What I'd like to talk to you about today is why you should not outsource thinking. And, you know, can you see my screen there?
It's still sharing, it says.
Okay. Yes, let me try this again. I do this every day, and for some reason today is the day it's not working. All right. Third time's the charm here, okay? We're going to go back to the old-fashioned way.
All right.
Apologies for that, folks.
It happens.
How's that?
There we go.
Okay. Thank you so much. Well, I would like to talk to you about what red team thinking is, where it comes from, and how it works. As Tim said, I am the president of Red Team Thinking and the author of the book Red Teaming, among others. So I'd like to start by just telling you a little bit about where this idea comes from and how it works, the science and psychology behind it, give you a little bit of an overview of the Red Team Thinking Toolkit, and then most importantly, give you 3 things that you can start doing today to think more critically and to make better decisions in today's complex and rapidly changing world. So, as Tim mentioned, my first book was about Ford Motor Company, and and as Tim also mentioned, I was a journalist at the time when I wrote it, and my American Icon became a bestseller, and a lot of CEOs started using it as a manual for turning their organizations around. And so I decided to quit my job as a journalist at the end of 2013. But before I left, I had one last interview with Bill Ford, the great grandson of Henry Ford, chairman of Ford Motor Company. And I said, Bill, you must be sleeping a lot better these days. 5 years ago, 6 years ago, your company was on the verge of bankruptcy. And yet, against the backdrop of the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression, you guys turned it around. You're posting record profits. Your share prices recovered. You're the most admired American manufacturer. You must be sleeping a lot more soundly these days. And he surprised me because he said, actually, I'm still having a hard time sleeping, because now what I'm worried about is complacency. Now what I'm worried about is slipping back into the bad behaviors that got us in trouble in the first place. Now what I'm worried about is losing our edge, that we might stop pushing ourselves, that we might start challenging ourselves and doing the things that made us successful. And that set me on a quest to find a way to help companies in any organization, really, and any leader to figure out how to avoid that, how to avoid complacency, how to avoid stagnation, how to continue to challenge themselves even when they're successful. And that led me to discover decision support red teaming. And that is something that I have evolved into what I call red team thinking. So what is red team thinking? Red team thinking is a cognitive capability that engages critical thinking, enables distributed decision-making, encourages diversity of thought, which is really important. We hear a lot today about diversity and inclusion, but as the head of our diversity and inclusion practice, Ellie Cloak likes to say, diversity without inclusion is delusion. And a lot of organizations use diversity just to create a checkbox to check off, but they don't listen to the people they bring in. And so they're not getting diversity of thought. And so red team thinking is designed to promote diversity of thought as well, and to identify both threats and opportunities. And I'm going to talk about this a little bit more in a minute, but this is really important, both threats and opportunities. It is a set of tools, and I'll go over some of those tools later in my presentation today. But more important than that, it's a mindset. The tools let you navigate complexity, identify threats and opportunities we talked about, consider new ideas and new perspectives, and make better decisions. But the mindset is a way of looking at the world through a critical, contrarian lens. And that is so important because it's all about continually to challenge yourself, continue to challenge your thinking, to continue to challenge your organization's thinking, so that you can disrupt yourself rather than become one of the disrupted. That's the point of all this. So where does it come from? Well, it starts with this gentleman up on the left here. And for those of you who don't recognize him, this is Socrates. And the reason I start with Socrates is because Socrates is really the first person, at least in the Western intellectual tradition, to use critical thinking as a means of understanding how the world works. So Socrates famously didn't promulgate a doctrine or write books espousing a particular idea or gather the people of Athens around him and tell them this is the way the world works. No, what Socrates did was ask questions, and he didn't stop asking questions. And there's a great story I'd like to share. You know, Athens was facing a big catastrophe, a big dilemma. And so they sent a delegation to the Oracle of Delphi. They went to Delphi and they sacrificed, and they went before the Oracle and they said, "Oh, great Oracle, we have this major problem. Tell us what to do about it." And she said, "Why are you here? Why are you asking me? Go ask Socrates, because he's the wisest of all the Greeks." So they said, "Oh, well, guess we could have saved the money of that sacrifice, but all right." They went back to Athens and went to Socrates' house. They knocked on his door. They said, "Socrates, we went to Delphi and the Oracle said that we should come and ask you what to do because you are the wisest of all the Greeks." Socrates said, "Yes, it's true. I am the wisest of all the Greeks because I alone among you know that I know nothing." And that was how he approached his quest for knowledge, was to ask questions. So we call this method of learning by asking questions today the Socratic method. And it used to be an important part of classical education in the West. And unfortunately, in recent decades, we've stopped teaching children how to do this. We stopped teaching college students how to do this. And instead we teach the test. We teach, more on rote learning and things like that. And so getting back to this concept of applied critical thinking is really important. The gentleman to the right is probably the best named pope in history, Pope Sixtus V, not to be confused with Pope Fifthus VI. Now, Pope Sixtus V had a very interesting problem. He had too many saints, and there were more saints being created all the time. He was the Pope in the late 1500s. And he said, this is getting out of control. Just managing the calendar of saints' feast days is becoming very confusing. So he said, let's apply a little bit of this thing that's all the rage here in Italy right now, is the beginning of the Renaissance, rational thinking to the process. So he created an office in the Vatican, still exists to this day, called the Office of the Advocatus Diaboli, the devil's advocate. And the job of the devil's advocate was and is to take every candidate for sainthood and do its best to argue that their supposed miracles had rational scientific explanations and their supposed good deeds were really just blatant self-promotion. And when the devil's advocate got to work, the number of saints being created dropped by over 95%, and it stayed at that historic low pretty much ever since. And as I said, it still continues to this day. So for instance, when Mother Teresa was put forward as a candidate for sainthood a few years ago, the Office of the Devil's Advocate called the famous British atheist Christopher Hitchens to testify against her. And he argued that she was not a good person at all, that in fact, by feeding the poor of India, she had prevented the Indian government from developing the necessary social programs to take care of its own people. And he didn't succeed. She became a saint. And so he complained that he had been not only not listened to, but not paid, and therefore forced to represent the devil pro bono. But this is really the first time that I can find, at least, of it in history where an organization comes up with a deliberate methodology for challenging its own thinking. But it certainly wasn't the last. In the 1790s, about 200 years later, the Prussians had a very different problem. They had just been beaten by Napoleon. And let me tell you, if you were a Prussian general in the 1790s, there was no greater humiliation that you could conceive of than having been bested on the battlefield by a French corporal. So they weren't gonna take that. So, but they had an interesting moment of self-awareness. They recognized that none of them was as good as Napoleon. So they said, right, we better make sure we have a bulletproof strategy. To do that, they came up with this concept called wargaming, Kriegspiel. And they said, we're going to play out our strategy in tabletop exercise before we actually play it out on the battlefield. And to do that, we're going to take a group of our best officers and we're going to divide them in half. And half of them are going to play us, the good guys. Now, did any of you have Crayola crayons when you were kids? Anybody? Excellent. Do you remember Prussian blue? It's actually one of my favorite colors. Prussian blue was called Prussian blue because the Prussians used to wear these spiffy blue uniforms. So they were the blue team. And since they were practicing fighting the evil revolutionary French, They made them the red team. And that's where the term red team and red teaming come from. Now, the final thing that I want to talk about is September 11th. So two things happened as a result of the terrorist attacks of September 11th that directly led to the creation of red teaming and red team thinking. The first is that on September 12th, just after midnight, less than 24 hours after the terrorist attacks, the director of the CIA, George Tenet, called a meeting of his senior team in Langley and said, look, folks, we have a problem. And I don't just mean that we've been attacked by Al-Qaeda. We have a problem in that we didn't anticipate this attack. And yet we had all this evidence that pointed to it. We should have seen this coming. And the reason we didn't is because we got complacent and we didn't challenge our assumptions. So he created a team in the CIA called the Red Cell. And the job of the Red Cell was and is to take whatever the prevailing thinking of the CIA is and directly and deliberately challenge it. And to do this, the Red Cell has developed a number of tools, many of which form the basis of the Red Team Thinking Toolkit. The other thing that happened as a result of the terrorist attacks of 9/11, obviously, is that we invaded Iraq and Afghanistan. And initially, at least from the point of view of the US military, things were going pretty well. Remember, the president went and stood on the aircraft carrier and said, mission accomplished and all that good stuff. And then suddenly we found ourselves enmeshed in this massive, endless insurgency. And when that happened, the Army realized it too had suffered a failure of imagination. When they analyzed it, they realized that many of the problems that had led to the situation we now found ourselves in were because the Army had failed to challenge its own thinking, to challenge its own assumptions, to look at the situation from the perspective of other participants, other key stakeholders, like, say, the Iraqi people. And so they set up a school at Fort Leavenworth at the Command and General Staff College, informally called Red Teaming University, to teach senior military officers how to use applied critical thinking and groupthink mitigation techniques to overcome bias, to overcome blind spots, and to make better decisions. In 2015, I became the first and only civilian from outside government to graduate from the US Army's Red Team Leader course. I spent the next couple of years taking the tools and ideas that I learned there and learned from others who do this, like the British military, the CIA, the Marines, the Australians, New Zealanders, because this discipline spread worldwide throughout military and intelligence community, and figuring out how to port these ideas to business. And I wrote my second book in 2017, Red Teaming, to teach organizations how to do just that. But I didn't stop there, because I learned as I started teaching organizations how to do this, that this formal model that the military had developed created its own problems. It could be time consuming, it could slow down decision making, it could create political challenges in the organization. And so I evolved that into what I now call red team thinking, which is something that doesn't require a separate team, but is a way of teaching individuals how to do this themselves so that they can make better decisions every single day. And when I was working on my book, I had the opportunity to work with some of the most amazing scientists who study how we make decisions. People like Dr. Daniel Kahneman and this gentleman, Dr. Gary Klein, two of the leading cognitive scientists in the world today. And when I was explaining red team thinking to Dr. Klein, we were having lunch in Washington, D.C. Back in 2015. He started smiling, and he took his pen out of his coat pocket and he wrote this formula on a napkin and slid it across the table to me with a big smile on his face. And I looked at it and I said, Gary, I have absolutely no idea what that means. And he said, I know, but I'm going to explain it to you. And he said, P equals performance improvement. Up arrow means innovation and down arrow means error reduction. And he said, this is my magic formula that I have developed, having spent decades studying how organizations work and which organizations are successful and which ones aren't. And he said, what I have learned is that the real key to success is improving innovation and reducing mistakes. I said, that makes pretty common sense. Did it take you 40 years of research to figure that out? And he said, no, he said, it is common sense. But he said, here's the biggest point. Almost every methodology that you can think of does one or the other. Almost nothing does both. And he said, let me give you an example. He said, I've spent 20 years studying hospitals in the United States, and a lot of hospitals have adopted Six Sigma. He said, what I found is that hospitals that adopt Six Sigma have much fewer accidental deaths than hospitals that don't. That makes sense, I said. He said, right, but here's the shocking part. They have worse long-term outcomes for patients than hospitals that didn't adopt Six Sigma. And he said, I was curious as to why that was. And he said, what I discovered was that it's because hospitals that adopt Six Sigma think they've cracked the code. They can put up a chart at their next administrators meeting and say, look at this, the number of accidental deaths at the hospital has gone down 20% year over year. Our work is finished. Let's go play golf. Whereas hospitals that don't adopt Six Sigma are more likely to invest and participate in exploratory experimental treatments, novel therapies, new cutting edge approaches to medicine. Yeah, they still kill patients by writing sloppy prescriptions and putting the wrong IV bags in people's arms, but the patients that survive have better outcomes. And he said that he found the same thing in companies too, that companies that adopted Six Sigma were more likely to have lower rates of inefficiency in their production systems and other processes, but they were less innovative. And so he said, red team thinking, as you describe it, is one of the only things I've ever seen that addresses both innovation and avoiding mistakes. And that's really key. That's why we need it. But there's other reasons why we need this too. And part of the reason is because we live in what a lot of experts call a VUCA world. And VUCA, for those who haven't encountered that term, stands for volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. And now in the past few years, people have added an H to it for hyperconnectivity. And it really describes the world we all live in today, where events on one side of the planet have an effect on us in real time, and where everything is tied to everything else. One of the great thinkers that I was able to work with when I was researching this book, Marine Corps General Paul Van Riper, he said that when you're dealing with complex problems like the ones that we're dealing with today in the world, it's like playing chess on a chessboard in which every piece is connected to every other piece with a rubber band. So you move one pawn and every other piece on the board changes position. That's the world we live in today. And the tools, the decision-making tools, the business tools, all of the tools that we learned in business school, they're not well suited for that world. So that's why we need this new approach. The other reason we need this approach is because applied critical thinking and problem solving are what businesses recognize they need today. And I'll just share a little bit of data with you here. A survey of CEOs by the World Economic Forum a few years ago found that critical thinking and analysis and problem solving were the two most important skills that companies anticipated they were going to need by 2025. But here's the amazing thing. A survey by McKinsey last year found that HR professionals found that those are the exact skills that are the hardest to find and the hardest to hire for. Why? Because, as I said, we don't teach people how to do this anymore. The final reason why we need this is because most businesses die from self-inflicted wounds. This is something in the 20 years I spent as a business journalist that I came to believe firmly. Now, you may look at this list and say, well, let's take Kodak. Kodak didn't die from a self-inflicted wound. Kodak went out of business because of digital photography, right? Well, here's the problem with that. Kodak invented digital photography. Kodak actually invented the digital camera. They filed the first patent for a digital camera, and they had a meeting of their board of directors, of their senior leadership in the early, about 1984, 1985 timeframe, where they discussed what they should do about this amazing new technology they had developed. And you know what they decided at that meeting? They decided, at the end of the day, we're not really a photography company, we're a chemical company. We make chemically treated film, chemically treated paper, and the chemicals that are used to produce photographs. So this is interesting, but let's not dabble in this digital photography world. And they went out of business. Now, an interesting counterpoint to that is Fujifilm. Any of you remember Fujifilm? So Fujifilm had the exact same conversation at Kodak at the exact same time, but they came to a very different conclusion. And by the way, Fuji didn't invent digital photography. They didn't have any patents for digital photography, but they were smart enough to look at the world and see that everything was becoming digital. And so Fuji had a conversation and said, what are we going to do about that? And they, just like Kodak, they said, well, at the end of the day, what are we? Well, we're a chemical company, not a photography company. And they said, great. There's a lot of other things that you can do with chemistry besides photography. And so they decided to run their photography business into the ground. And what I mean by that is they took every yen they made from selling film and photographic paper and invested it in new business units. They created a division to produce chemicals for the cosmetic industry, one of the largest in the world today. They created a division to create chemicals for the pharmaceutical industry, one of the largest in the world today. They took their film knowledge and figured out how to create a division to create protective films for the automotive and aerospace industries. And since the mid-1980s, Fuji's been profitable every year. They've grown, they've never missed a beat. And they even acquired Xerox and a bunch of other companies to diversify. The point is it was a choice. Two companies with the same choice, one put themselves out of business with their choice, the other became incredibly successful. And that is a choice that we all face. But it wasn't because Kodak was stupid that they made that choice. It was because Adam Smith was wrong. And what I mean by that is that ever since the 1700s, when Adam Smith wrote The Wealth of Nations, everybody who studies how human beings make decisions has believed, because Adam Smith told us this was the case, that we all make fundamentally rational decisions. And that if we make bad decisions, it's because of one of two things. Either we're swayed by strong emotions like love or anger or an unhealthy obsession with tulips or NFTs, or more likely because we didn't have the information we needed to make a better decision. But unfortunately, in the past 30, 40 years, scientists like Dr. Daniel Kahneman, who won the Nobel Prize for his work in this area, have proven in literally thousands of experiments that that's how we wish we made decisions. That in fact, the way that we actually make decisions is a lot messier. And it's based on two things, what they call system one thinking and system two thinking. This is how our brains work. System one thinking is unconscious and automatic. You know that fire is hot, that ice is cold, that water is wet. And if it's pouring rain outside, you don't need to think very deeply about whether you should take an umbrella with you when you go out. That's system one thinking. It's automatic. System two thinking is what we mean when we say thinking. It's hard, it's deliberate, it's effortful. And that's where the problem lies. Because as Kahneman has proved in so many experiments, our brains are lazy. And because our brains are lazy, we often use system one thinking, when we think we're using system two thinking. And that's where the problems come in. So let me give you a way of testing this. And you don't have to share your answer. I just want you to, I'm not going to embarrass anyone. I just want you to write this down or think of the answer yourself here. I'm going to give you a simple math problem that Kahneman came up with. A bat and a ball cost $1.10. The bat cost $1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? Just spend a minute and think about the answer. How much does the ball cost? Bat and ball cost $1.10. Bat cost $1 more than the ball. How much is the ball? Got your answer? All right. The correct answer is 5 cents. I will tell you, because I've done this experiment over 100 times, that most of you got this wrong. And if you got this wrong, don't worry. You're not in bad company, because more than 50% of Harvard, MIT, and Princeton students got it wrong. And as Kahneman writes in his very kind of elitist way, more than 80% of students at lesser universities also get this wrong. And the reason is because when you look at this problem, you think you're engaging system 2 thinking, but you're really engaging system 1 thinking. You're not actually thinking it through. And that's not such a big deal when you don't remember how much a ball cost, but it is a big deal when you're making big decisions. And that's the point. All of us, no matter how smart we are, no matter how well educated we are, no matter how successful we are, fall victim to a dizzying array of cognitive biases and heuristics, which is just a fancy scientific word for mental blind spots, that skew our thinking in ways that we're not even aware of. And I'm not going to go through all of these. We don't have time, but these are things that we all suffer from. And red team thinking is designed to help us overcome these. Now, when we get into organizations, we get an additional set of threats to good decision making. We get groupthink. We get satisficing, which is the fancy scientific term for going with the first idea that occurs to you rather than seeing if there's another better idea, which is how most organizations make decisions. And then you get bureaucracy, you get internal politics, you get careerism, all of these organizational pressures that prevent organizations from making the best decision possible consistently. So we've come up with this approach to help individuals and organizations overcome these things by countering unconscious bias, by creating tools and techniques that force people to use system 2 thinking, that allow other voices to be heard, alternative perspectives to be considered, to get people to challenge their assumptions, and most importantly, to get people to think for themselves. The motto of my company is don't outsource thinking. And the problem is too many leaders, too many organizations today outsource thinking to others rather than thinking for themselves. And by others, it could be, McKinsey or Bain. And I'm sorry if anyone works for any of the big consulting companies, but I think they're one of the worst things that's ever befell business, because they prevent leaders from leading. And the same is true as us as individuals. Too many of us have let our chosen news network think for us rather than thinking for ourselves too. So this is individuals and organizations that I'm talking about. So I'm not going to go through all the red team thinking tools. There's a lot of them. I want to get to how you can start using some of these tools today to make better decisions in your life and in your business. The first piece of advice I have for you is to challenge your assumptions. We all make assumptions. There's nothing wrong with making assumptions. You have to make assumptions to make a decision. The problem is when you don't recognize that you're making assumptions, or when you mistake your assumptions for facts. So when you were making an important decision, sit down and just write a list of the assumptions that underlie that. And then ask yourself, going down that list, how certain are you that each of these assumptions will prove true? And if you see some that you're not sure of, circle them with a red pen, and then say, what could I do to increase the odds that those risky assumptions do prove true? And if I can't increase the odds that those risky assumptions prove true, is there a way I could change my plan or my decision so that it doesn't rely so much on those risky assumptions? And finally, think about what you are going to do if you have to make those risky assumptions. What are your contingency plans going to be if they don't prove true? So that's my first piece of advice. My second piece of advice is contemplate failure. It's something we almost never do. When we come up with a plan, as one of my clients, a big private equity firm that we've worked with, one of the principals there says, when you come up with a plan, you become pregnant with the plan. Think about that. You become pregnant with the plan. And when you become pregnant with the plan, you stop looking at it critically. You're just thinking about how wonderful it's going to be, how great it's going to be, how much money you're going to make, how wonderful life's going to be when it becomes a success. The thing is that if you take a few minutes and imagine that your plan fails spectacularly, And then you work backwards and you ask yourself, how did that happen? How did that failure occur? Well, then you could take steps proactively to address those points of failure, to decrease the likelihood that they will occur. And it's a really powerful concept. The final thing you can do to avoid satisficing is consider the alternatives. And what I mean by that is, don't just go with the first viable option that occurs to you. Take a few minutes. It doesn't have to be a lot of time. Just take a few minutes and think. Force yourself to come up with at least one other viable option. I don't mean a straw man, a horrible idea, so you can check it off the list and say, well, I came up with another idea. It was horrible, so I'm going with my first idea. No, really challenge yourself to come up with another option. And then weigh those two options to see which is the best, or even better, is there a third way that incorporates the best elements of both of those? Just spending 10, 15, 20 minutes doing that will amaze you at how much better your ideation is, how much better your decisions are. This is just a little taste of what red team thinking is and how it works. But I tell you, if you do these things and you do them consistently, you'll be amazed at the difference that they make in your decision-making, your lives, your businesses, in everything. That's all I have, except time for questions.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Bryce. Appreciate that. Let me get you to unshare your screen.
Yes. I just also want to give anyone wants to follow me on LinkedIn or on my podcast, here's the information.
That's right. Go ahead and you can leave it up. I've got the gallery up now.
Okay.
All right. Let's see. Any hands, any questions from anybody? Raise your hand either virtually or and come off mute. Anybody? Let's see here. Susan, and then Patricia. Come off mute. Susan.
This makes me smile because so many people think education is so far behind business. It was 1972 in San Francisco, SFUSD, that we had a movement about critical thinking, and some of the experts at the time teach us that. And then I remember at San Francisco State studying the problem-solving model. But thank you for this, because this is such an encapsulation of what historically has been studied and worked. So do you do this? Do you go back to education in the schools that are having problems, some of the public schools, and bring your red team thinking back to schools who've kind of gone away from the critical thinking structure?
You know, Susan, that's a great question. And I'm an alum of San Francisco State as well. And I will tell you that I wish we could, but we focus our energy on businesses and governments and militaries and other organizations around the world, because I'll be honest with you, I think schools have become so focused, at least public schools have become so focused on teaching to the test, on checking boxes rather than education. I hope that will change. I was in the UK last July and giving a closed door presentation to senior government leaders on this, and a very senior member of the British government asked me, how can we spread this all over the country? We need this in every aspect of the UK. And I said, well, there's a simple way to do it. You could teach this in secondary school. And I was pleasantly surprised that afterwards a woman came up to me who may or may not have been with the Ministry of Education there, who said that that's something they would very much like to consider. I think, this could benefit anybody. I've just, I was a government reporter before I was a business reporter, and I switched to becoming a business reporter because I despaired of government's ability to respond effectively to things and to take and run with new ideas. And that's why I focused more on business. But it'd be great if it could happen.
Well, and the other thing is, you could focus specifically, but if we produced a group of people who actually thought, we wouldn't have so many of the problems that you now have to solve. You could widen your net. Anyway,
I couldn't agree more, Susan.
Yeah. Thank you. This was wonderful.
Thank you.
A group of teachers or former teachers to join the insurgency, as they say, and go in from the inside.
Absolutely.
Patricia, and then Paul Coleman.
Brilliant presentation.
Thank you.
Brilliant. Unbelievable. Mind expanding. And I remember my dad, and this was when I was a little girl, very much influenced by him, but he was talking about how he always worked on what was the worst thing that could ever happen. Now he's more brilliant than I realized. My question was going to be, and I think you answered it with Susan, who is more open, business or the military?
So I would say that amazingly, the military has been quite, I mean, the military was where I learned about this. And, people, before I did this, I was amazed that this type of thinking was created in the military, because my view of the military was not so much focused on intellectual prowess. I was amazed when I went through this program. I learned more in 3 months at the Command and General Staff College in the Red TV program than I learned in my entire time at San Francisco State. And there are people there who have learned some very painful lessons over the past few decades, and they're determined not to repeat them. And that's what's led to the receptibility of this type of thinking. I think that I still believe, though, that businesses are able to change direction faster and to embrace new ideas more rapidly. And I think some of the best businesses do this unofficially already. So when I was, before I decided to quit my pause my own business and spend the first half of 2015 at Fort Leavenworth, garden spot of the American plains. It's not, I will tell you. I wanted to make sure that I wasn't the only one who thought this was going to be a worthwhile thing to learn. And so I talked with some friends who I respected, and one of them was a senior executive, for instance, at Amazon. And when I described the Army's approach to him, he said, "This is amazing." He said, "This sounds exactly like what we do. We don't call it red teaming, but this is how we approach problems. This is why we've become such disruptors." And this is a guy who's been with Amazon since, they were working out of a warehouse in Seattle. And he said, it's really interesting. He said, because he says, whenever I go to a conference and I'm asked to speak somewhere, because I'm an Amazon executive, whenever I'm done, I always get collared by people from old economy companies. And they say, how can we be more like Amazon? And he says that I always feel like a bit of a jerk, because the only thing I've ever been able to tell them is, well, you can start over. Because he said, this is so ingrained in our DNA. And it's been this way since Bezos was running the company out of his garage. And he said, this is the first thing I've seen, though, that could teach an established organization how to think like we do. So that's one of the big reasons why I took the plunge and did this.
Sounds good. Paul Coleman, then Bill Buchanan.
Yes, good morning, Bryce. Thank you very
Paul.
much. That was absolutely fascinating. It's the second time I've heard a presentation on red team thinking, and I have to say I think I know more about it or feel more accustomed to it now. Thank you. So that was very good. But I have to say, and I say this, my question is with the greatest respect. My background is risk management and internal auditing. Now, what I would like to say to you is, and particularly in the light of the corporate failures that you gave examples of, is this not just a risk management plus product, or can you sort of separate the two and say, well, this, it's one more angle to it?
So I would say that
respectfully, because obviously you're very passionate about it, and I respect that.
No problem at all. It's a question that I've gotten before. I would say that risk management is a small subset of this, because as I talked about, avoiding risk is only one half of the equation. And what we're trying to do is challenge people to think differently, not just to avoid risk, but to challenge their thinking in everything that they do, to bring in different voices in their organizations. One of the things that I learned, Paul, in the 20 years that I worked as a business journalist, when I was inside literally hundreds of different companies, from Intel and Oracle to Ford and Chrysler, is that every organization, I've never been in an organization that didn't have all the answers it needed right there inside the organization. And yet in most organizations, it didn't matter, because those people who had those good ideas were stymied by the bureaucracy, by the hierarchy, by other internal pressures, weren't able to surface those good ideas. And so what this is designed to do is crack open the organization and get those good answers out, get leaders to be able to surface the ideas that are on their teams and to lead more effectively that way. A part of that is definitely avoiding and managing risk, but it's only a small part of it.
If I could just follow up with one
Yeah.
comment on that, it makes me think that the biggest challenge is the leaders of the business to be switched on to this type of thinking, because, as I say, with a background in risk management, you can say what you like to the senior leaders, and they'll just turn around and say, "Well, yeah, well, that will never happen," and sort of end of story. And they could stop all this. You use the word stymied, and I like that analogy really, because that has always been one of the big bugbears in risk management.
Absolutely. And
so,
that's
thank you.
That's why, Paul, this is about teaching people how to do this themselves rather than coming in as consultants and doing it for them. So, to your point, when I was the first time I met Daniel Kahneman, we were having breakfast at NYU, and I was explaining to this approach to him, and I said, "Do you think this will work?" And by the way, if you ever want to feel really stupid, have breakfast with a Nobel laureate. It's not a great way to start your day if you want to feel smart. But I said, "Do you think this will work?" And he said, "Well, conceptually, I think it'll work." He says, "But you're going to have the same problem that every consultant has, that if you tell people, that here's the problem, they don't want to solve it. They're just, as soon as you leave, they're going to say, he doesn't understand. He's not part of our organization." And they're going to dismiss it. And I said, "That's the thing, though. I'm never going to do that." And he said, "Well, how are you going to make money if you don't come in and tell people what the problem is and how to solve it?" I said, "All of this, Daniel, is about teaching people tools. They're going to be the ones that use the tools, not me, to find the problems." And then and I explained to him, I was in New York working with a client, and I explained to him how I was working with the CEO and his senior leadership team of a very famous company. And I was teaching them how to use these tools to review their turnaround strategy. And they surfaced major problem with the strategy. And when they did, I stopped the meeting and I said, "Okay, did everybody just hear?" It was their chief marketing officer who kind of cracked the code. I said, "Did everyone just hear what Margaret said?" And everyone nodded. And I said to the CEO, "Did you just hear what she said?" And he nodded. I said, "Does anybody disagree with what she said?" Everyone said, "No, we completely agree. She's right. I can't believe we missed this. We all see it now." I said, "All right, now note this. You said this yourselves. Bryce Hoffman didn't tell you this. You told yourselves this. So what are you going to do to fix it?" And they got to work and they fixed it. And so that's the thing. You're absolutely right, Paul. One of the first things they taught us when I was at the Command and General Staff College is you can't red team in the fear bunker. You have to be in an organization that's willing to learn, willing to challenge itself. But if you can use these tools in an organization like that, it can be completely game changing. So thank you, Paul.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bill Buchanan, followed by Randall Reeder, and then Alan Garber.
Good morning, Bryce. Bill Buchanan here. Really enjoyed your presentation. I always say the model presentation for the GB is the Golden Gate Breakfast Club is to walk away thinking faster or better than you did, right?
Excellent.
So, anyway, as you were making your presentation, I was thinking to myself, decades ago, more than I would like to admit, I read a book about a gentleman who was pretty much in your same model, I think. And that was, it would be 50s or 60s. I think his name started with a D. And he said, you know, there are some big problems with some major corporations. I hear
Deming.
Deming. I was going to say, was it Deming?
Yes, the Deming.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
you know what he did? He went and studied their assembly lines and all kinds of.
Yep, that
And
was
he
Deming.
went to, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I think he went to, I don't know, like Ford Motor or something. He
Mhm.
said, look, this is what you need to do. It's quality control. You're screwing up. You're not looking at it down the line, you know, make sure you have quality procedures and you'll get a great product. They said, get out of here. So he went over to Japan,
Yep.
right? Am I talking
Yep.
about-
You're absolutely right.
And they said, great. And so you get these Japanese companies are just, you know, outpacing some American companies anyway.
I was at you know, I used to be an auto industry reporter, and I had the pleasure of going to Japan and going to Toyota's headquarters. And I walked down the hall at Toyota's headquarters, and there was a huge statue of Deming right in their lobby.
Amazing. So we
Yeah.
need 2 Toyotas on the garage. Anyway, and then I started thinking about your process here. And I have a military background and, you know, government service and stuff like that. But I've always been a fan of critical thinking. And I try to apply it in my business and also personally, not as successfully as you, obviously. But anyway, I'm thinking to myself, I keep hearing, like, you read the Wall Street Journal, and
Yep.
you see things like a Vanguard fund is moving away from ESG focus because they don't think it works very well. They want to go back to, hey, let's look at the best interests of our investor clients instead of ESG, environmental social governance, which is kind of I don't quite understand it yet, but what does it have to do with a business focus? And then the other thing that occurred to me as you were talking was there seems to be a creeping, it's almost like an amyloid plaque that you see in dementia in universities, for instance, is one example where there's kind of a closed loop of hiring people with just one mindset into the faculty. And all of a sudden, if you raise your hand and say, wait a minute, I have another idea on that, some really serious consequences could happen to you, like losing your job. One example is a professor in a Midwest university, I forget where it was, but he wrote a white paper on a colony in Africa. He said, you know, in this case, actually colonialism helped him out. Guess what happened to him? Fired, out. You know, all his plans for the future gone. Now, my question to you is this. You think, is this sort of thing, which, you know, as you know, may or may not know, some of the service academies have had workshops on things like CRT and all that sort of thing. It seems like to me it's a distraction. In your case, I mean, in your mind, is this sort of thing good or bad?
Well, I go back to, you know, there's a famous quote from Patton that if everybody's thinking alike, then somebody isn't thinking. And, you know, as I said, diversity of thought is so important. And if everybody is thinking the same way, then whatever the organization is, it's going to stagnate and it's going to wither and it's going to die because there's going to be no innovation. People aren't going to challenge each other. You look at Intel, you know, Andy Grove was a big advocate. I had the privilege of covering Intel back in the 90s when Andy Grove was still running the company. And Andy Grove was famous for advocating what he called constructive conflict. And, you know, his point was that people should argue with each other in meetings, not in a nasty or mean-spirited sort of way, but in a constructive and a collegial way. They should debate things. They should challenge each other, you know. And I think that we have an interesting dilemma as a society. We have adopted 2 mutually exclusive principles. One is that everybody has the right to say whatever they want, and everyone also has the right to never be offended. Those things don't work together. And you know, I think the fact that we have made those the 2 pillars of and by the way, this is not a political thing, it's left and right both. You know, it's paralyzed us and it's ripping us apart. And that's why I really think thinking for yourself is the solution to the myriad of problems that we face as a society today. That's why I'm doing this.
Thank you. Great presentation,
Thank you.
Bryce.
Rieger and then Alan Garber.
Okay. Well, thank you. Excellent presentation. Bill's question kind of preluded what I had in mind to ask you, but I'll ask it anyway. You mentioned military is really good. And question, is politics getting in the way of there? And I have two phases of that. One is that if the military wants to build a new airplane or get more numbers of a certain airplane, they have to almost order components from all 50 states and almost every congressional district to get approval. So that's one. The other relates to, I think Bill brought it up, diversity, have to use the right pronoun and other things relating to the last 2 or 3 years. It seems like that's probably interfering. So what's your reaction to that? Well,
I mean, yeah, our military is completely hamstrung by politics and by the political system. In more ways than we have time to even unpack if we spent the entire day doing it. But just to your points, I mean, this is something really interesting that you raised, Randall. You know, I was reading an analysis just last month by a senior military planner and expert, and they pointed out, you know, we make a great. We talk a lot about how well, you know, we spend so much. Our military spending is so much higher than China's, so that we have nothing to worry about from the Chinese. But here's the thing: when the Chinese build a new jet fighter, they build a factory that builds all the parts, and they make the new jet fighter at that factory, and then it rolls off the assembly line and out onto a runway, just like we used to make aircraft in World War II. Yeah. When we make a new fighter, to your point, it's farmed out to 50 different states and 50 different companies, and none of them are working together, and everything gets cobbled together at the end, and then you see that they get recalled because there's all these technical problems with them. But more than that, we've spent 50 times what the Chinese spend for the same thing because it's so inefficient. And so the fact that we spend so much more money doesn't necessarily mean we have a better outcome. The other thing is, you know, I'll give you an example. People sometimes ask me when I tell them about the origins of red team thinking, well, if this works so well, why did we end up in such a bad place in Iraq or Afghanistan? Well, the answer is simple, is because it wasn't allowed to work. It wasn't the military that came up with these policies. I'll give you a great example. The very first time that red team thinking was used in a conscious and formal way by the military was during the surge in Iraq. Anybody remember the surge back in like 2006? And it's interesting because so General Petraeus, who was in charge of the war at the time, was an early advocate. He'd been at Fort Leavenworth when the program was stood up, and he was a big believer. And he said, when he got put in charge of Iraq, he said, this is great. This is going to be our first opportunity to really try this out. And the president said, we need to pull out of Iraq. And he said, great, we're going to red team this. And they red teamed it. They said, right, the way to pull out of Iraq is we have to send more troops to Iraq. We're going to surge a big number of troops. We're going to pacify the country. We're going to stand up the police force and make sure that everyone's that they're policing themselves. And here's my plan. And he said, it's going to take 2 years to do this. And he warned Washington that halfway through this, things are going to be looking so good that you're going to want to say, mission accomplished. And if you pull back at that point, it's all going to fall apart. And he even warned them of this. And sure enough, you know, the surge happened, the violence went down. If you remember, there was no bombings or kidnappings and stuff. And then the politicians said, great, this is good enough. Let's pull out now. And so my point is that if you look at the consequences of these things, that wasn't the military's fault, but the military in this country serves at the pleasure of the politicians. And so they were told, no, we're not going to finish this. We're going to do this. And they saluted and said, yes, sir. And we all know how that turned out.
Okay, Alan Garber.
Thank you, Bryce. This is a very good presentation. In my profession, I'm a labor and employment lawyer. I represent companies and give advice and defend them in many issues involving their employees. And one of the major things that we have, of course, is the discrimination laws. And every company now is basically forced to have a diversity, inclusion, equity officer. I call it the DIE, because I think what it does is it kills some companies, because they're forced now to look at diversity not in critical thinking, but only in immutable characteristics of people, whether they're Black, white, gay, Indian, Chinese, whatever it is. They're checking boxes.
Right.
We've seen this, and it doesn't help any companies. What it does, I think, in what we see, I think, in the cabinet of the United States right now, in our government, people are just checking boxes. And how do you, when you're talking to, say, HR people and dealing with these issues, they have to balance staying out of the anti-discrimination laws versus having their company run with the proper people that are going to be able to critically think. And I don't care if they all look alike or if they all look different. The company has to go and have a mission. And within that mission, I think they have to have diversity of thought, as you were saying. And it's not there. And it's also not there in universities, we see now. So how do you deal with that, or what's your opinions on that subject?
Well, it's like I said before. I think diversity without inclusion is delusion, and I think too much of what we call diversity and inclusion is just checking the box. Like I said, I actually think there is real value in having people from diverse backgrounds in a company if you listen to them, if they are heard in the thinking process. Yeah, I think that you see a lot of big companies that are run entirely by people who look like me, who are lost in the tar pit of the past and can't kind of move forward because everybody thinks alike. And by bringing in people with diverse backgrounds, you have an opportunity to get different perspectives that can really help the organization, but only if it's real, only, not if it's just a political exercise. So I'll give you a perfect example of this. During the planning of the invasion of Iraq, there was, even back then, there was beginning to be this effort to create diversity in the military. And at the plan during the planning, there was one key piece of the first day of the war was going to be the deploying the 11th Attack Helicopter Regiment to go and destroy the Iraqi Republican Guards, which is their elite tank forces. And in the room was a young woman, a young lieutenant, who had been promoted to this planning team in part because of a diversity initiative. And she was listening as they had the sandbox models, where they had the terrain all modeled out, and they were using the sticks with the helicopters on it to show how the 11th Attack Helicopter Regiment was going to fly up here and surprise the Iraqi Republican Guard and destroy them. And that we were going to send Air Force planes in front of the helicopters that were going to destroy all the surface to air missiles, so they weren't going to have any problems. And all the generals and colonels who were all, older white men, were congratulating themselves on this brilliant plan. And this young woman raised her hand and she said, "What about small arms fire?" And everybody in the room just glared at her with like, "How dare, don't you know you're just here to check a box? Just go sit in the corner and color and let the adults get on with their business." And they said, "You're not a pilot. You don't understand this stuff. You're an intelligence officer. Small arms can't shoot down helicopters. Go over it in the corner and color." Well, guess what happened, folks? They launched the mission, and just like they had planned, the the F-111s went in front of the Apache helicopters and took out all the surface to air missiles, and everything was going great. And they were approaching the city where the Republican Guard was massed. And all of a sudden, the radios just lit up with pilots saying, "What the hell is happening here? There's 10,000 people firing at us with their AK-47s and rifles and machine guns." And yes, a rifle or a machine gun couldn't shoot down a helicopter, but guess what happened? Our helicopters are very sophisticated. And one by one, the sensors on the helicopters began to get hit by bullets. And it was night, and pilots were screaming, "I can't see anything. I'm blind. I'm blind." And they actually ended up shooting down one helicopter, one crashed on our lines. But most importantly, not a single Iraqi tank was destroyed. The entire mission was a failure. And 60% of the helicopters were so damaged that they were unable to participate in the rest of the war. Whose idea was that? It was the young lieutenant, the female lieutenant who everyone dismissed. That's the value of real diversity. And the reason she was able to surface that is because she wasn't blinded by the preconceived notions that everyone else in the room had.
Yeah, Bryce, that's true. But one thing that you said that's very important, I think, is that it's diversity of background and knowledge.
Yes.
Not the immutable characteristic that you have, whether you're a woman. It wasn't because she was a woman. It's because she had a different background. Now, she could have just as well been a 20-year-old white boy from Kansas and come up with the same hypothesis as to what these small arms are going to do. So my point is, when you put the DIE in front of the background and knowledge part, that's where you're going to run into trouble, and your diversity breaks apart.
So we encourage, one of the things we strongly encourage all of our clients to do when they're putting together teams is to bring together people, as you say, with diverse experience and diverse backgrounds. And often people who look different do have diverse backgrounds, but it's important to consider that, not just the surface features, so to speak. And so we always, if we're working with a company with international operations, we always encourage them to bring in people from their, if they have divisions in Latin America or Africa, to bring in executives from those groups too. If they have younger people. We just did a program with NATO, for instance, last year about the situation that's going on over there. And the best ideas in the room were surfaced by an intern, a Portuguese intern, who they didn't want to bring into the planning meeting, but we insisted that they bring in their lowest level person. And she, again, had some of the best ideas in the room. And in fact, the admiral in charge was like, "How do we convince you to go from an intern to enlisting in the Portuguese military now?" It's as I say, this diversity of thought is critical, and it's a lot more important than checking boxes.
Correct.
Any other questions? I don't see any.
I have a question. I have a question for you, Bryce.
Yes.
Why don't you tell the story of the tribal leader prior to the invasion talking to the generals about asking the right question?
Absolutely. Yeah. So that's so it was one of the tribal leaders, actually a cleric, Imam al-Sayyid al-Khoi, who was one of the senior Iraqi clerics. So this is one of the foundation stories of the U.S. Army's Red Team program, one of the things that led to it. So the 2 weeks before the invasion of Iraq, the general and the colonel in charge of intelligence for the invasion were summoned by the CIA to a meeting with this sheikh, and they were told by the CIA, "This is our man in Iraq, and he's going to help us after we overthrow Saddam, and this is basically an opportunity to ask him anything as you fine-tune the war plans." And so they meet with him, and they are peppering him with questions, and they are asking, How wide are the roads in Basra? Will our tanks fit there? Here's these cool leaflets we're going to drop on Iraqi troops to get them to surrender. Do you think the messaging will work? Things like this. And he spends a couple hours patiently answering all their questions. But the colonel who was facilitating this noticed that with each question, he was getting more and more frustrated. And finally, after a couple of hours, one of the generals was asking another question. And he said, look, I'm going to answer your question, but I've been answering your questions for 2 hours now. Can I ask you a question? And they were like, oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Ask us whatever you want to ask. And he said, how long are you planning on staying in my country? And they totally misunderstood his question. They thought he was like saying, how quickly can you get out of here? And so they said, oh, don't worry, Imam. We think that we will take Baghdad in at most 3 months, and then we'll start a 6-month timetable for withdrawing our troops. And by the end of the year, Allied forces will be out of Iraq. And, because it's going to be like France in 1944, they told him, you're a country with valuable resources, with industry, with an intelligent, well-educated population. We're going to get out of your way and let you rebuild Iraq. And he nodded and he said, let me tell you something. He said, Saddam killed my father. Saddam imprisoned my brother. Saddam imprisoned my mother. And he went down for the next 10 minutes telling them about every person in his family who'd been killed or disappeared or imprisoned by Saddam. And he said, I'm telling you all of this so that you have no doubt in your mind where I stand before what I'm about to tell you. So that you have no doubt that I am no friend of Saddam Hussein's. He said, but having told you everything I just told you about how my family has suffered under Saddam Hussein, I want to ask you to stop. Stop, just stop. Take your planes, take your tanks, take your soldiers and go home. He said, because if that's your plan, you are going to unleash something on this country that is far worse than Saddam Hussein. And for the next 2 hours, he proceeded to school them in the history of Iraq and the social structure of Iraq, telling them about all the different tribal and religious factions, about how Saddam had so skillfully for decades pitted Sunnis versus Shiites versus this tribe versus that tribe to divide and rule the country, and how the British had done that for a century before that, and how everybody had a rifle buried under their backyard, about the criminal networks that existed in the country that could be mobilized and turned into an insurgency. And at the end of this, he said, let me tell you something. He says, you think this is going to be France in 1944 with pretty girls throwing flowers at your feet? No. He said, this is going to be Yugoslavia the day after Tito died on steroids. Everybody is going to kill everybody else. And interestingly enough, 3 days after the liberation of Basra, where he had been the cleric, he was murdered by a mob from a rival cleric and became one of the first people killed. And the generals and the colonel who were at that meeting, when they rode back to the base, they were like, why are we just having this conversation 2 weeks before the war started? Why didn't we talk to him a year ago? And they wrote a paper, they sent it to the generals in charge, who sent it to Tony Blair and George Bush, saying, maybe we need to reconsider this a little bit here before we rush in. And the response was, it's too late. We're here, we're going. And everything he predicted happened. And that's why it's so important to get these alternative perspectives and alternative ideas in when you're making particularly a big plan, like invading another country.
Well, Alan, you have another?
I have to go. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Such great questions. It's really a pleasure to speak with you all.
We look forward to hearing more about you and from you later on. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Hey, Bryce.
Yeah.
Before you leave, could you explain the boot camp, the Red Team Thinking Boot Camp and the Red Team Coaching Boot Camp, which is going on right now for people who might want to learn more about this?
Absolutely. Right now, we are actually offering free Red Team boot camps in partnership with coaching.com. We've got half a dozen of them over the next 3 weeks. So if you're interested in learning more about this, just go to redteamthinking.com and you'll see a link right on the front page to register.
Okay.
Thank you, Tim.
Thank you.
Bryce,
Thank you all. Yes.
I just wanted to add that ear reading Daniel Kahneman's book made my brain explode.
Mine too.
It's brilliant. But his Nobel is in behavioral economics.
Yeah, it's in economics. Yeah. But he's not an economist. He's a psychologist.
No, he's a
Yeah,
psychologist.
yeah, yeah. He won the Nobel Prize for economics.
All right, y'all have a great week and
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Great.
thank you, and thanks, Tim,
Thank
for
you.
organizing
Yes,
this.
thank you,
Thank
Tim.
you,
Yay.
Tim.
Bye-bye.
And next
Thank
week
you.
we'll